Not one. That is the number of rifles the United States Army ever bought from the man who designed a better one. In 1940, the Army was buying semi-automatic rifles by the hundreds of thousands. It was tooling 2 factories, training a generation of instructors, and arming a nation for a war it could already see coming. And the man who walked into that moment with an alternative was not an arms manufacturer, not an engineer, and not a career soldier. He was a Boston lawyer who had taught at Harvard. He told Congress, in public, under oath, that the Army's chosen rifle was defective. The Army's ordnance officers heard him say it. They neither forgot it nor forgave it. When the domestic door closed, he sold his rifle to a colony on the other side of the world that was about to be overrun. When the shipment was finally ready to sail, the War Department seized it as a military secret. He died with the company bankrupt, the rifle half forgotten, and the single idea at the center of it all, sitting on the shoulder of nearly every American soldier who came after him. This is the story of a rifle designed by a Marine, a rifle that went to war against the Army's own supply line, and a rifle that cost its maker everything he owned except the one thing nobody could repossess. It is the story of how those weapons were built, who paid for them, who buried them, and what every decision behind them actually cost. Chapter 1. The Observer's Bet. In the middle of the 1930s, the United States Army sent a young Marine Reserve officer to Springfield Armory to watch the future being built. His name was Melvin Maynard Johnson, Jr. He was born in Boston in August of 1909, schooled at Noble and Greenough, and graduated from Harvard Law in 1934. He practiced law in the city and, for a period, taught it. On paper, he was a lawyer. That is the first thing to understand about him, because nothing else about the next 15 years makes sense without it. Johnson had been commissioned a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps Reserve in 1933. He took the firearms courses at Quantico. He was, by every account, a serious student of weapons, the kind of amateur who reads the patents, disassembles the mechanisms, and forms opinions. And in that capacity, he was posted to Springfield Armory as the Marine Corps' observer, watching the Army work through a problem that had consumed military ordnance departments for 2 decades. The problem was the self-loading rifle. That problem was old and expensive. Since before the First World War, American ordnance officers had been trying to replace the bolt-action rifle with something that reloaded itself. There had been the Pedersen device in 1918, a contraption that turned a bolt-action Springfield into an automatic. There had been years of trials in the 1920s and early 1930s, the T-series experiments, the long duel between John Pedersen's design and John Garand's, fought out on ranges and in reports across an entire decade. By the mid-1930s, the American taxpayer had already funded 20 years of institutional effort aimed at exactly one goal: a reliable, semi-automatic infantry rifle, chosen, standardized, and put into mass production. That was the machine Johnson was sent to observe. Not a blank page. A 20-year program approaching its conclusion. The weight of that institutional investment is the thing to hold in mind, because it is the force everything Johnson did would break against. 2 decades of trials meant 2 decades of officers building careers on the program, 2 decades of accumulated reports and test data, 2 decades of a bureaucracy learning to defend its choices. An institution that has spent that long and that much reaching a decision does not experience a challenge to that decision as new information. It experiences it as an attack. And the challenger here was not a rival arms giant with its own factories and its own political weight. It was one man with a day job. Consider the double life that implies. By day, and in the classroom, Melvin Johnson was a Boston attorney who had taught law at Harvard. In his other hours, he was designing a rifle to beat the United States Army's 20-year program, drawing on a Marine Reserve Commission and a hobbyist's obsession with mechanisms. There is something almost quixotic in the picture, the lawyer at the workbench, and the channel does not romanticize it. It notes only the asymmetry. On one side, an institution with 2 decades of momentum and a national mobilization behind it. On the other, an amateur with a patent application and $300 of machine shop work. Amateurs do sometimes beat institutions. But when the institution is also the amateur's only possible customer, winning the technical fight and winning the business are 2 entirely different contests, and Johnson was about to win the first and lose the second. The stakes behind that program were plain. For 400 years, the infantryman had reloaded his weapon by hand. A bolt-action rifleman fired, worked the bolt, re-aimed, and fired again. A semi-automatic rifleman simply fired again. On a firing line, that was the difference between 1 volume of fire and 2 or 3 times that volume from the same number of men. The first nation to put a reliable self-loader into every soldier's hands would hold an advantage measured not in inches but in multiples. The arithmetic was obvious. The engineering was not, which is why it had taken 20 years and was not finished yet. At Springfield, Johnson examined the competing designs. the Pedersen and the Garand, the weapons that had been fought over through all those trials, and he came to a conclusion that a more cautious man, an employee, a man inside the institution, would have kept to himself. He decided the Army was choosing wrong. His objection was technical, and it is worth stating plainly because it became the seed of everything. The Army's favored design, John Garand's rifle, was gas-operated. It tapped a small amount of high-pressure gas from each fired cartridge and used it to drive the action that ejected the spent case and chambered the next round. Johnson believed a gas system depended too heavily on the ammunition behaving exactly as designed, cartridge after cartridge, and he did not trust that ammunition produced under the chaos of a full wartime mobilization would be that consistent. He thought the system was elegant in peacetime and fragile in the only conditions that mattered. Whether that objection was correct is a question gunsmiths still argue. What matters for this story is what Johnson did with it. He did not file a memo. He went home and started designing his own rifle. His approach differed from Garand's in the one way that defined it. Instead of tapping gas, Johnson used the recoil of the barrel itself. When the rifle fired, the barrel and bolt recoiled a short distance locked together, and only then did the bolt rotate, unlock, and cycle. The locking was done by a bolt with multiple lugs that turned into the barrel, a rotating bolt whose ancestry Johnson traced to an old Austrian design, the Schwarzlose. Hold on to that bolt. It is the thread that runs through the entire story, and it will still be turning long after the company is dead. The first working model was built in a machine shop, and by Johnson's own account, it cost about $300 to have made. That is the founding gamble, and its smallness is the point. This was not a capitalized enterprise. There was no factory, no board, no line of credit from an arms fortune. There was a lawyer with a day job, a patent application filed in April of 1936, and a rifle he had paid a machinist a few $100s to cut for him. He organized what he had under the name Johnson Automatics Trust, run out of Brookline, Massachusetts, and later out of an office in the India Building in downtown Boston. Set that against what he proposed to fight. By the time Johnson held a complete prototype in the second half of 1936, the United States Army had already, months earlier, formally adopted John Garand's rifle as the Meters one. That decision was made in January of 1936. The competition Johnson intended to enter was, in the most literal sense, already over before his rifle existed. This is the first decision at the center of the story, and it was not made by a company, because there was no company yet. It was made by one man. Melvin Johnson looked at an institution he had been sent to observe, an institution that had already spent 20 years and enormous public money reaching its conclusion, and he decided that his $300 rifle was better, and that he would prove it. Not privately, publicly. There is a version of this story where that is admirable and a version where it is reckless, and the channel takes no position on which. It only notes the business fact underneath it. A man who intends to sell rifles has, in the United States in 1936, essentially one customer of any size. That customer is the government, and Johnson had decided that the way to win that customer was to tell it, loudly, that it had already made a mistake. The rifle would turn out to be good. That was never really the problem. The problem was the customer, and Johnson had chosen the customer he could least afford to insult. The Army had made its choice. It had made it before his rifle existed, and it had made it with factories that were already, that year, beginning to move. Chapter 2. The rifle that came second. The Johnson rifle worked. That has to be established clearly, because the rest of the story only carries weight if the weapon at the center of it was genuinely good, and it was. The path to a working rifle ran through other people's factories, because Johnson had none of his own. To build prototypes for evaluation, he first partnered with Marlin Firearms of New Haven, Connecticut. Early models, including a prototype designated the R-14, were tested through the late 1930s. In August of 1938, the design went before an Army Ordnance Board at Aberdeen Proving Ground. The trials showed promise and also showed problems. The early vertical box magazine fed poorly. The rifle was long and heavy. It could not take a conventional bayonet, a defect the Army treated as serious. Johnson went back and revised. He improved the extraction, reworked the cocking handle, and, most importantly, replaced the troublesome magazine with a rotary design inspired by the old Krag rifle, a curved spool that could be topped off at any time. For the next round of Army trials, in December of 1939, he partnered with the Taft-Pierce Company of Woonsocket, Rhode Island. The Ordnance Board praised the workmanship and rejected the rifle again, on the same grounds: length, weight, and the bayonet. By the end of the decade, the refined weapon had a name and a date: the model of 1941. It was recoil-operated, as Johnson had insisted from the start, with that multi-lug rotating bolt locking into the barrel. It fed from the rotary magazine set into the side of the receiver, a spool that held 10 rounds. That magazine was one of the rifle's real advantages, and the advantage was not the 2 extra rounds, though it held 2 more than the Garand's 8. The advantage was how it loaded. The Garand fed from an unblocked clip, a steel frame holding 8 cartridges, inserted as a unit and not easily topped off. The Johnson's rotary magazine could be filled with loose single rounds or with standard 5-round stripper clips, and it could be topped off at any time, with the bolt closed, without interrupting the rifle's readiness to fire. A soldier could fire 4 rounds, push in 5 more, and stand at full capacity without taking the rifle out of action. A second advantage was unusual. The Johnson's barrel could be removed quickly, by hand, without tools, and the whole rifle came apart into a short package. For most infantry, that was a curiosity. For one specific kind of soldier, it would matter enormously, and he arrives later in the story. A third advantage was felt at the shoulder. Because the barrel recoiled as part of the action, the recoil of the Johnson was noticeably softer than the Garand's, by some measurements roughly a third less. On a rifle range, less recoil means faster recovery between shots and, for many shooters, better accuracy. The accuracy was not a marketing claim. When the Marine Corps tested the rifle in the spring of 1940, the Johnson posted an accuracy rating of 81.2% against the Garand's 71.3% in the same evaluation. A Marine officer named George Van Orden, sent to assess it, wrote that the Johnson's semi-automatic rifle was, in his exact words, materially superior to the United States rifle, caliber 30, meters 1 in accuracy and potential combat efficiency. That is not faint praise from a service with every reason to be conservative. It is a professional officer putting on paper that the challenger beat the champion. There is context behind the Army's conservatism that makes the rejection even easier to understand as business, and it involves a wound the service had only recently taken. John Garand's rifle had originally been designed around a smaller cartridge, the .276 Pedersen, a round many ordnance experts considered technically superior for a self-loader. The Army had been on the verge of adopting that combination. Then, in 1932, the decision was overruled from the top, and the rifle was redesigned around the existing .30-06 cartridge instead, largely because the country already held vast stockpiles of .30-06 ammunition and could not afford, in the Depression, to start over on a new round. In other words, the Army had already lived through one painful, expensive reversal in this exact program, driven by exactly the kind of standardization and cost logic that now protected the Garand. Having been forced once to swallow a hard, practical compromise to keep its supply chain intact, the institution was in no mood, a few years later, to tear the whole thing up again for a challenger's marginal gains. And the Johnson carried a specific structural liability that the ordnance boards fixated on, one that flowed directly from its cleverest feature. Because the barrel recoiled as part of the action, anything that interfered with the barrel's movement interfered with the rifle's function. A standard bayonet, fixed to the muzzle, added weight to the moving barrel and could disrupt the cycle. The Johnson's answer was a light, spindly spike bayonet that most observers considered inferior to a real fighting knife on the end of a rifle. For an infantry weapon expected to fix bayonets and be used in the assault, that was not a trivial complaint. It was the recoil system's brilliance and its curse, tangled together in the same mechanism, and the Army noticed. So the rifle was real. And here the business tragedy takes its actual shape, because the quality of the rifle was never going to be the deciding factor. The deciding factor had been decided in January of 1936, and its name was arithmetic. By 1940, the Army was not evaluating whether a semi-automatic rifle was a good idea. That question was 4 years closed. The Army was executing. Springfield Armory was building meters 1 Garands at a rate that would climb toward, and past, 2,000 rifles a week. And the Army had begun the enormous work of tooling a second manufacturer, Winchester Repeating Arms, to build the same rifle in quantity. Every one of those machines, every gauge, every fixture, every trained inspector represented sunk cost and forward momentum aimed at a single standardized weapon. To adopt the Johnson now, even if it were the better rifle, the Army would have to stop. It would have to retool. It would have to retrain. It would have to accept a gap in production, in the exact years it least wanted a gap, in order to switch to a rifle that was, in its own tests, sometimes better and sometimes not. Later tests, in November of 1940, had the Garand edging the Johnson. The overall picture was 2 rifles of roughly comparable capability, one of which was already pouring out of a factory, and one of which existed in the low hundreds. State that as a business proposition, and the answer writes itself. No purchasing organization on Earth, having committed to a standard and built the plant to produce it, switches suppliers midstream for a marginal and contested improvement. The Ordnance Department's rejection of the Johnson is often told as blindness, or spite, or bureaucratic cowardice. Some of it, later, would genuinely become spite. But the core of the decision was none of those things. The Army's objection was not ignorance. It was arithmetic. Johnson understood the arithmetic perfectly well. He was a lawyer. He could read a balance sheet and a production schedule. And so he made the second fateful decision of the story. which follows directly from the first. If the rifle could not win on its merits inside a system that had already closed, then he would go outside the system. He would take the argument over the Ordnance Department's head, to the public, to the press, and to the Congress of the United States. He had a rifle that beat the Army's rifle on a good day. He decided to make sure everyone knew it. 2,000 Garands a week were already leaving Springfield. He decided to fight that number in the newspapers. Chapter 3. The Original Sin. In the spring of 1940, the fight over the Johnson rifle stopped being a matter of ordnance testing and became a matter of politics. That transition is the hinge of the entire story, and it is the moment a business historian circles in red, because it is the moment a promising company acquired the one liability it could never pay off. There had already been a quieter rejection. After an informal test in June of 1938, the Ordnance Department had declined further involvement with the Johnson, citing weaknesses in the design. A cautious man would have read that as the end of the road and looked for a private buyer. Johnson read it as an injustice to be appealed to a higher court, and the higher court he chose was Congress. Johnson came from a family with connections, and he used them. Through 1939 and into 1940, he pressed his case beyond the Ordnance Department to the men who controlled the Ordnance Department's money. A representative from Pennsylvania named Snyder began asking, out loud in committee, why the government was spending millions to tool up the Garand when this promising new rifle existed and had not been given a fair hearing. The question spread. The Senate took it up. A senator from Johnson's own Massachusetts, Henry Cabot Lodge, emerged as a supporter. A representative from Texas went further and introduced a bill proposing that the Army simply adopt the Johnson. It came to a formal head on the 29th of May, 1940, when a Senate committee opened hearings on that bill, numbered 3983, to make the Johnson semi-automatic rifle a standard arm of the United States military. Johnson testified first. Behind him came what one account describes as a retinue of industrial experts and military officers, there to attest to the rifle's virtues. On the other side sat the Ordnance Department's own officers, defending the Garand, and at moments effectively accusing the Johnson camp's factory men of lying about how quickly they could tool up and deliver. The surviving record captures senators who plainly did not grasp the mechanics of what they were being asked to legislate, working through basic questions of recoil and gas operation while the experts talked past them. Around the same time, there was a demonstration at Fort Belvoir, described as the first true side-by-side shooting of the two rifles under Army eyes. A civilian marksman firing the Johnson outscored the Army's own Garand expert, by one account 472 to 436. It was exactly the kind of result Johnson wanted on the record. It was also exactly the kind of result that hardened everyone it was meant to persuade. Consider what the demonstration and the hearings actually accomplished. They did not get the rifle adopted. The proceedings concluded roughly where the arithmetic said they would. The two rifles were judged near equals, and since the Garand was already in production, no change was warranted. Johnson won the argument and lost the vote, which in procurement is simply losing. What he also did, and this is the part that killed the company before the company had really begun, was make the fight personal inside the one institution that would decide his fate. He had stood up in public and in the national press and told the United States Army that its rifle, the rifle its own officers had spent 2 decades and a fortune developing, was inferior to his. He had made congressmen ask embarrassing questions about how the Army spent its money. He had arranged a demonstration whose entire purpose was to beat the service's marksmen with their own weapon. A contemporary account of the affair put the consequence with unusual clarity. The military's senior officers, it observed, had neither forgotten nor forgiven the inventor's original sin. The original sin was not a design flaw. It was the act of public criticism itself. Weigh the audacity of what Johnson had done, in institutional terms, because it explains the depth of the reaction. A serving Marine Reserve officer had gone around his own military's professional judgment, enlisted congressmen to interrogate that judgment in public, and staged a shooting match designed to embarrass the Army's own experts, all to overturn a procurement decision the service had spent 20 years and a fortune making. From inside the institution, this was close to insubordination dressed as entrepreneurship. Whatever the merits of the rifle, the method guaranteed that the officers whose judgment he had challenged would treat his success as their humiliation and his failure as their vindication. He had made his rifle's adoption personally costly to the exact people who would decide it. This is the structural danger of selling to a single institutional buyer, and it is worth naming as a general principle because it recurs wherever a company depends on one dominant customer, whether that customer is a government, a giant retailer, or a single platform. When one buyer holds the entire market, that buyer holds every card. It sets the price, the terms, the timeline, and it can punish a supplier not only by declining to buy, but by making sure the supplier's other options quietly close. A seller in that position survives on the buyer's goodwill as much as on the quality of the goods. Johnson had spent that goodwill down to nothing, in public, on principle, and there was no way to earn it back. The moment he made the Ordnance Department look foolish in front of Congress, he was no longer a supplier the department might someday buy from. He was a problem the department would prefer to see disappear. State the business position coldly. Melvin Johnson was a manufacturer whose product had, in the United States, exactly one customer of meaningful size. That customer was the federal government. And inside that government, the specific office that bought rifles was the Army Ordnance Department. And Johnson had spent 1940 making that office look wasteful and wrong in front of its paymasters. He had converted his sole domestic customer into an adversary with a long memory and control over every door he would ever need to walk through. There is a lesson here that generalizes far past rifles. When the state is the entire market, humiliating the state is not righteous. It is a solvency risk. A company can survive a bad product. It has a much harder time surviving the permanent hostility of the only institution allowed to buy what it makes. Johnson had chosen to be right in the loudest possible way. Being right, it turned out, was not an asset that appeared anywhere on the ledger. Congress agreed that the rifles were equal. Equal was not enough to stop a factory that was already running. And the men who ran that factory now had a reason to make certain the Johnson rifle never found a home anywhere the Ordnance Department could reach. Chapter 4. A customer about to lose a war. With the American door shut and, worse, bolted from the inside by men he had personally offended, Johnson did the only thing a rifle maker with no domestic buyer can do. He looked abroad. And what he found there reveals how narrow his options had become. Because the only government on earth willing to buy an American infantry rifle in quantity in 1940 was a government preparing to lose a war. The buyer was the Netherlands. Specifically, the Netherlands Purchasing Commission, the body the Dutch used to acquire arms after the German occupation of the home country in May of 1940. The Dutch held a vast and vulnerable colony in the Pacific, the Netherlands, East Indies, modern Indonesia, and the threat to it was obvious. Japan was expanding. The East Indies had oil, the exact resource an expanding empire needed most, which made the colony both a target and a prize. The garrison there needed modern rifles, and it needed them from somewhere that was not occupied Europe. The United States had them. And here was an American rifle whose own army had inexplicably declined to buy it, which meant it was actually available for export, or so it seemed at the time. On the 19th of August, 1940, the Netherlands Purchasing Commission placed the order that made Johnson Automatics a real company. The most commonly cited figures are an order for 10,200 rifles, together with 515 light machine guns, followed by a second order for another 10,200 rifles. The exact totals vary between sources, and some accounts describe the intended Dutch requirement in far larger numbers still. But the concrete contracted quantities that set the factory in motion sit in that range. The rifles were priced at roughly $125 each. On the rifles alone, that is a contract on the order of $1.25 million in 1940 money, arriving in the hands of a company that until that moment had been a lawyer, a patent, and a few hundred hand-built guns. It was the making of the company. It was also, in the same stroke, the shape of the trap. Look at the structure of the deal from a distance, the way an analyst examines any company that lives or dies on a single account. Johnson Automatics now had essentially one customer. That customer was a colonial government whose territory sat directly in the path of an expanding empire. The entire value of the company was a promise to deliver rifles to a place that might not exist, in any friendly form, by the time the rifles were built. Every dollar of the company's future was tied to the survival of the Dutch East Indies, and the survival of the Dutch East Indies was, by 1940, one of the worst bets available on the map. Look closely at how bad that bet was, because the numbers were visible to anyone who cared to read a map. The Netherlands East Indies were defended by a colonial army, the NIL, that was modest in size and thinly spread across thousands of islands. The home country had already fallen to Germany in a matter of days in May of 1940, which meant the colony could expect little reinforcement. And the thing that made the colony worth defending, its oil, the fields around Balikpapan and Tarakan, was precisely the thing that made it a primary target for a resource-hungry Japan. A more exposed customer would have been hard to invent. When the blow finally came, it came fast. The Japanese offensive against the East Indies opened in early 1942, and the colony's organized resistance collapsed within weeks, the surrender coming in March. The garrison Johnson was arming was overrun almost before his rifles could reach it. So the concentration of risk was not merely that the company had one customer. It was that the one customer was, on the evidence available at the time the contract was signed, likely to be conquered. This is worse than the ordinary single customer trap, where the danger is that the buyer might switch suppliers or cut orders. Here the danger was that the buyer itself, the government, the army, the territory, might simply cease to exist as a going concern before the goods arrived. Johnson had escaped the hostility of the American market by binding his company to a customer whose own survival was the longest of long shots. It was the only deal on the table. That is exactly the point. A company with no other options does not get to choose a safe customer. It takes the only one that will have it, and prices in none of the risk, because it cannot afford to. This is the recurring pattern of the whole format, and Johnson's version of it is unusually pure. A single large contract is a lifeline and a noose at the same time. It is the money that builds the factory. It is also the concentration of risk that means one event, entirely outside the company's control, on the other side of the planet, can erase the enterprise in an afternoon. Johnson had escaped the closed American market by tying his entire company to a customer even more fragile than the market he had left. And there was a further irony folded inside the contract, one that cut against the man personally. To fill an order this size, Johnson could no longer be what he had always wanted to be. By his own repeated statement, Johnson never wanted to manufacture rifles at all. He wanted to be a designer. He wanted to sell the design, the patents, the idea, to a government or a great arms company, and let them bear the cost and grind of production while he collected on the drawings. That was the clean, capital-light business he had imagined from the start. He would draw the future and let others build it. The Dutch contract took that away from him. There was no established manufacturer standing ready to build the Johnson rifle, because the one industry with the capacity and the government's blessing, the American arms industry, was busy building Garands and was, in any case, not inclined to help a man who had just attacked the Army's program. If Johnson wanted to deliver these rifles, he would have to build them himself. He would have to become the very thing he had tried to avoid becoming, a manufacturer, with a factory, a workforce, and a payroll, in an industry where he held powerful enemies. The order that saved him forced him into the one role he had spent years trying not to play. He had wanted to sell paper. Now, to survive, he had to build a rifle factory from an empty building in 5 months, in a country that was quietly making sure he could not get the machines to do it. Chapter 5. Cranston Arms. The building was a dead textile plant. To manufacture the Dutch rifles, Johnson Automatics leased part of a shutdown factory belonging to the Universal Winding Company, a maker of textile machinery, in Cranston, Rhode Island. The operation was set up under a separate corporate name, Cranston Arms Company, and this small structural detail is itself worth noticing. The rifles the Marines and the Dutch would carry were stamped and known as Johnson rifles, and the design and the reputation belonged to Johnson Automatics, but the physical manufacturing was done by a distinct entity in leased space in someone else's idle mill. The company was, from the start, a set of arrangements rather than a fortress. It owned very little. It rented, contracted, and improvised. Turning a textile mill into an arms plant in the middle of a national defense mobilization was not a matter of moving in some benches. A rifle factory needs specialized machinery, and the most specialized of all is the equipment that cuts the rifling, the spiral grooves inside a barrel that spin the bullet and make it accurate. Rifling machines were, at that exact moment, government restricted. The same defense emergency that had created Johnson's foreign customer had also placed a controlling hand on the tools he needed to serve it. He had to source rifling equipment, contract out for barrels, contract out for wooden stocks, and assemble a workforce with the skills to build precision firearms, all at a time when every one of those things was scarce because the entire American arms industry was scaling up at once and bidding against him for the same men and the same steel. He did it in about 5 months. The first production rifle from the Cranston plant was test-fired on the 19th of April, 1941. By the standards of what he was attempting, in the conditions he was attempting it in, that was a genuine feat of execution, and it deserves plain credit. A lawyer with no manufacturing background stood up a working precision arms factory in leased space against material shortages and quiet official obstruction in less than half a year. Whatever else is true of Melvin Johnson, the man could execute. But consider the economics of a factory built for exactly one contract, because they are unforgiving in a way that the impressive speed of the build can disguise. Standing up an arms plant is enormously expensive in fixed costs. The machinery, the tooling, the gauges, the trained workforce, the leased building, all of it has to be paid for before the first rifle sells. In a healthy manufacturing business, those fixed costs are spread across a long future of orders, amortized over years and multiple customers, so that each rifle carries only a small share of the overhead. Cranston Arms had no long future of orders to spread its costs across. It had the Dutch contract, and after the Dutch contract, an empty order book and a hostile home government. Every fixed cost of the factory had to be justified by a single stream of revenue that would end the moment the last contracted rifle shipped. That is why a one-contract factory is a countdown rather than a company. The building of it is a bet not just that the customer will pay, but that more customers will follow, because without them, the tooling never earns back what it cost. Johnson had no more customers coming. The American military would not buy. No other foreign government was placing orders of comparable size. The impressive factory in Cranston was, from the day it opened, a machine for fulfilling one contract and then going quiet. And the only thing that could have saved it was precisely the domestic military demand that Johnson's own public fight had put permanently out of reach. He had built the supply. He had, by his own earlier choices, destroyed the demand. And here the format's hardest lesson applies. Because execution and viability are not the same thing. Johnson had built a factory. What he had not built, and could not build, was a business that stood on more than one leg. The Cranston plant existed for one reason and served one contract. Its entire purpose was the Dutch order. It had been financed, tooled, staffed, and justified by that single stream of foreign money, aimed at a single destination that was, month by month through 1941, becoming less likely to be reachable. A factory with one contract is not really a company. It is a countdown. Every rifle it produced was a rifle promised to a specific colonial army in a specific place. And the value of every one of those rifles depended entirely on that place remaining a friendly destination long enough to receive them. There was no domestic order to fall back on, because the domestic customer was hostile. There was no second foreign contract of comparable size. There was the Dutch East Indies, and there was time running out. The plant Johnson had built so impressively was, in strict business terms, a bet that the Dutch East Indies would still be there, and still be Dutch, when the rifles arrived. That was the wager the whole enterprise now rested on. And it was a wager on events 10,000 miles away that Melvin Johnson could not influence by a single day, no matter how many rifles his workers in Cranston finished and crated. The rifles were finally coming off the line, and at almost the same moment, the government that had refused to buy them decided that it would not permit anyone else to receive them either. Chapter 6. Seized as a secret. The killing of Johnson Automatics did not happen in a single event. It happened in two moves by the same hand, separated by a couple of years, and the second move reveals the whole logic of what had been done to the company. The first move was the refusal to buy. The second move was the refusal to let anyone else buy. Together they form as clean a demonstration as the format ever gets of what it means when the only customer is also the regulator. The refusal to buy was already accomplished. By 1940, the Army had decided, and had let it be known, that it wanted nothing to do with the Johnson rifle, and the men who made that decision held personal reasons, on top of the arithmetic, to keep it that way. Johnson had gone abroad. He had found the Dutch. He had built the factory. He had found a way to live without the American customer who despised him. Then the second move came, and it closed the exit. The War Department moved to block the export of Johnson's weapons. The reasoning given was twofold. And both halves are worth stating, because both are the kind of official reasoning that is impossible to argue with and devastating to be on the wrong side of. First, the machine tools in Johnson's plant, the department held, were needed for existing American defense contracts and could not be devoted to building arms for a foreign buyer. Second, and more remarkably, Johnson's designs were declared to constitute military secrets, information too sensitive to be exported, even to a friendly nation, even to an ally directly in the path of the same enemy the United States would soon be fighting. Sit with the shape of that. The United States Army had officially examined the Johnson rifle and officially declared it not good enough to adopt. And now the same government declared that same rifle so militarily secret it could not be sold abroad. The rifle was simultaneously not worth buying and too valuable to release. Those two positions cannot both be sincere. What they can both be is convenient, if the actual goal is not to assess a rifle but to ensure that a particular inventor never builds an independent, thriving arms business outside the Ordnance Department's control. A contemporary account in the national press, reporting on the export block, did not pretend the reasoning was purely technical. It attributed the department's resistance directly to grievance, writing that the military's senior men had neither forgotten nor forgiven the inventor's original sin, that original sin being, once again, the public criticism of their rifle. The magazine framed the whole episode as an unpardonable one. The unpardonable act was not a defect in the gun. It was that Johnson had embarrassed the institution, and the institution now held every lever that could starve his company and was pulling them. The elegance of the two-move kill, from the institution's point of view, is that neither move required admitting the first. The government never had to say it was punishing Johnson for his criticism. It said the rifle was not good enough to buy, which was a defensible technical position, and then it said the rifle was too secret to export, which was a defensible security position, and the two positions, each reasonable on its own, combined into a perfect trap that no argument could open. A company can appeal a bad review of its product. A company can appeal an export restriction. But when the same authority applies both at once, declaring the product simultaneously not worth buying and too valuable to release, there is no coherent case left to make, because the two rulings do not share a premise. The only honest description of the combined effect is that the door was shut and the window was nailed and the company was inside. This is the deepest version of the single buyer problem, and it is worth stating as plainly as possible. When a company's sole customer is also the regulator of that company's other options, the customer is not really a customer at all. It is a warden. A normal buyer can hurt a supplier by walking away, and a supplier can respond by finding another buyer. A buyer who also controls export licenses, security classifications, and access to restricted machine tools can do far more than walk away. It can seal every exit at once, and it can do so while maintaining that each individual decision was made on its own narrow merits. Johnson had a factory full of excellent rifles and a warden who had decided, for reasons that were partly technical and substantially personal, that those rifles would go nowhere. And a warden, unlike a customer, cannot be won over by building a better product. The better the product, the more rifles simply pile up behind the sealed door. Then the wager on the Dutch East Indies came due, in the way the map had always threatened. Japan moved on the East Indies, and in early 1942 the colony fell. The rifles that had not yet shipped, the ones sitting in or bound for the United States, were embargoed. The customer, the entire company had been built to serve, ceased, in any practical sense, to exist. And in a final humiliation, a substantial quantity of the Johnson rifles that had reached Dutch forces, by some accounts around 4,000, were captured by the Japanese in Java, and roughly 2,000 of those were shipped back to Japan for study. The rifle the United States Army judged not worth adopting was worth a sea voyage to Tokyo for the enemy to examine. So, by 1942, the position was this. The domestic government would not buy the rifle. The domestic government would not let the rifle be exported. The foreign customer the company had been built around had been overrun, its territory in enemy hands, its contract embargoed. The Cranston plant had produced a stock of excellent rifles with, quite literally, nowhere to send them. A company whose only customer is also its regulator does not control any market at all. It exists at the pleasure of an institution that can be its buyer, its censor, and its executioner, and can play all three roles at once. Johnson had built a very good rifle and a very capable factory, and he had done both inside a cage whose bars were held by men he had personally insulted. Every technical success he achieved simply produced more rifles the cage would not let out. The rifle had nowhere left to go. And then, from an entirely unexpected direction, someone came looking for it. Not the army that had frozen it out. The Marines. And they came looking precisely because the Army's own rifle plant could not keep up. Chapter 7. The gun that outlived the plan. Before the Marines enter the story, the other weapon has to be introduced. Because the other weapon is the one that survives everything, and the format's rule is that the durable asset is rarely the one the founder is famous for. Alongside the rifle, Johnson had designed a light machine gun, completed around 1940. It shared the recoil-operated principle and the family resemblance, but it was built for a different job, and in that job it was arguably a more original and more useful weapon than the rifle ever was. The Johnson light machine gun weighed around 13 pounds. It fired from a bipod, fed from a magazine mounted on the left side rather than the top or bottom, and, crucially, it could be carried and operated by one man on the move. It had a quick-change barrel, like the rifle, and a rate of fire that could be regulated, running in the neighborhood of several hundred rounds a minute, with later versions climbing higher. A gunner could dial the cyclic rate down for controlled bursts or up for a wall of fire. The design details mattered because they added up to a genuinely different category of weapon, not a marginal improvement on an existing one. And that difference is the whole reason the gun found a life the rifle never could. The rifle competed head-on with the Garand for the same job, the standard infantry rifle, and in that contest, merely matching the incumbent was fatal. The light machine gun competed in a space where the incumbent, the Bar, had a real and obvious weakness. It was too heavy and too unwieldy for troops who had to move fast and light. The Johnson gun did not have to be dramatically better than the Bar at everything. It only had to be much better at one thing that a specific set of customers cared about intensely, which was being carried and fought by a single man in rough country. A product that is merely equal to the standard loses. A product that is decisively better on the one axis a niche customer values can win that niche outright, even against a larger, entrenched competitor. That is the difference between competing on sameness and competing on difference, and it runs straight through the two halves of Johnson's own catalog. The rifle was a sameness play against a standardized incumbent, and sameness against an incumbent is a losing hand every time. The machine gun was a difference play into an underserved niche, and difference is what lets a small maker carve out territory a giant has left exposed. Johnson, ironically, had staked his company, his reputation, and his public fight on the rifle, the weaker business proposition of the two. The stronger proposition, the gun that actually had a defensible market position, was the one he treated as the sideline. The market would spend the next 20 years correcting his emphasis for him, gun by gun, in places he never chose. To understand why that mattered requires understanding what it competed against, which was the Browning automatic rifle, the BAR. The BAR was the American squad's automatic weapon, and it was a fine gun, but it was heavy, around 20 pounds, it was long, and it was awkward to bring into action quickly. The Johnson gun offered something close to the BAR's firepower in a package a single soldier could carry up a hill, drop into position, and open fire with in seconds. For regular infantry, that trade was interesting. For soldiers who had to move fast, jump out of aircraft, land on beaches, or operate far from supply, it was close to ideal. The number of Johnson light machine guns built is one of the contested figures in this story. Some accounts put total production of the gun in the range of a few thousand, others as high as roughly 9,000 or 10,000 across its variants, with a unit cost around $265 apiece in 1941. Whichever figure is closer, the essential point holds. It was never made in the numbers of a standard-issue weapon, and it never won an official contract that would have made it one. It lived, like the rifle, in the margins. But the gun had a quality the rifle did not fully have, and that quality was portability of a kind that specialized forces would seek out on their own, without waiting for the Ordnance Department's blessing. This is the sleeper asset of the whole enterprise. Johnson had poured his ambition, his public fight, and his company's survival into the rifle. The rifle was the thing he testified about, the thing he took to Congress, the thing the Dutch contract was mostly built around. But it was the light machine gun, the secondary product, the one that never got its own hearing, that would prove to have the longer life. It would end up in the hands of elite units that specifically hunted for a lighter automatic weapon. It would cross oceans its maker never sold into. It would still be turning up in conflicts decades after Johnson Automatics was gone. The durable asset is rarely the one the founder is famous for. Johnson would be remembered, when he was remembered at all, as the man behind the rifle that lost to the Garand. But the object of his that traveled farthest and lasted longest and appeared in the strangest places was the machine gun almost nobody was arguing about. It would travel further than Johnson ever imagined, and to armies he never sold to, and by paths he never chose. First, though, the rifle and the gun both had to get into the war at all, and the way they finally did was not a sale. It was a gift. Chapter 8. 23 Rifles. The United States entered the Second World War in December of 1941 with a rifle shortage. The Meters 1 Garand was a fine weapon, and the decision to standardize on it had been sound. But sound decisions do not manufacture themselves overnight, and in the first year of the war, the Garand production lines could not yet arm everyone who needed arming at the speed the war demanded. That gap, between how many modern rifles the country had committed to and how many it could actually produce right now, is the crack through which the Johnson rifle finally reached a battlefield. The soldiers who slipped through that crack were the Marine parachutists, the Paramarines. They needed a rifle that could be broken down small enough to jump with, carried in a way a Garand could not easily be, and the Johnson rifle, with its quick detachable barrel and its short takedown package, answered that need almost perfectly. By an accident of Johnson's design choices, it was very nearly the ideal paratrooper's rifle at the exact moment the Marine Corps was building parachute units and could not get enough of anything else. What came next is one of the strangest procurement anecdotes in the American arms story, and it is pure business, so it belongs at the center of this chapter. Johnson did not sell the Marines their first rifles. He gave them away. Sensing an opening as the Garand lines struggled, Johnson Automatics unofficially donated a small number of rifles, by the common account 23 of them, to the Marine parachute troops training at New River, North Carolina. They arrived on the 26th of March, 1942. Johnson himself later described the arrangement, with a lawyer's dry precision, as more or less lend-lease which developed into a gift. 23 rifles. That is the entire origin of the Johnson Rifles American Combat Service. Not a contract, not a purchase order. A giveaway of 24 guns to a unit that needed them and had no other good option, made by a company desperate to get its product into the one place a rejected weapon could still redeem itself: combat, where performance is the only argument that counts. It worked well enough to lead to more. In October of 1942, the Marine parachutists wanted Johnson rifles in quantity, and with the approval of the Netherlands Purchasing Commission, whose embargoed rifles these effectively still were, a shipment of 650 Johnson rifles was delivered to the Marine Corps quartermaster in San Diego on the 7th of October, 1942. There is a telling detail in the records. None of those rifles were inspected by the Marines before shipment. The Corps was taking what it could get. Of those 650, the parachute regiment's own tables of organization authorized 242 Johnson rifles as standard equipment. The remaining several hundred were, by most accounts, never issued at all and sat in storage. The total Marine holding of Johnson rifles was never more than a few hundred guns. The free sample strategy behind the 23 donated rifles deserves a moment of respect as a piece of business thinking, because it was the correct move in a genuinely impossible position, And it reveals Johnson at his most clear-eyed. He could not sell to the American military. That door was sealed. But he could seed his product into a corner of the American military where the normal procurement machinery did not fully reach, a small, new, elite unit with an urgent, unmet need and the informality to accept a gift. Get the product into that unit's hands for free. Let it perform in combat. Let the after-action reports and the magazine stories do the selling that a locked-out inventor could not do himself. It is the oldest move in the book for a supplier frozen out by the front door. Give the sample away, and let the sample generate the demand that pulls a paid order in behind it. And it half worked, which is the poignant part. The gift did generate a follow-on order of 650 rifles. But look at where that order actually came from. It did not come from the United States Treasury, because the United States military still was not really buying Johnson rifles as a matter of policy. It came, on paper, through the approval of the Netherlands Purchasing Commission, releasing rifles that were still nominally Dutch property from the embargoed stock. The Marines got their Johnson rifles not by the American government finally deciding to buy them, but by borrowing, in effect, against a dead foreign contract. Even Johnson's cleverest go-to-market move could not break the fundamental fact of his situation. The one customer that mattered still would not put its own money down. It would accept the rifles as a wartime expedient, routed through a foreign commission, and it would take them back the moment the expedient was no longer needed. But a few hundred guns in the right hands, at the right moment, generate the anecdotes that make a weapon's reputation. In the fighting for Tulagi and the small islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo in the Solomons, a platoon sergeant of the 1st Parachute Battalion named Harry Tully used his Johnson rifle to devastating effect. He is credited with killing 42 Japanese soldiers on Gavutu, at ranges reported up to 800 yards, and he received the Silver Star. A national magazine carried the account in a December 1942 article. The rifle the Army had declared not worth adopting had, in the hands of one Marine on one island, produced exactly the kind of performance its designer had always claimed it could. Other Marine officers who saw the rifle in action gave it measured, professional respect. A company executive officer, Captain Harry Torgerson, confirmed the rifle was used by select scout snipers during the Guadalcanal campaign. It shot well, it was accurate, and its soft recoil suited precise work. In the specific niche it had fallen into, the specialist's rifle, the parachutist's rifle, the marksman's rifle, it performed and it earned its keep. There is a lesson in the 23 donated rifles that reaches well beyond this company. Sometimes the only way into a market closed against a seller is to stop charging admission at the door. Johnson could not sell the American military a rifle, so he gave the American military a rifle and let the rifle make the argument he was no longer allowed to make in a hearing room. It was a shrewd move, and it succeeded on its own terms. The Johnson rifle went to war. The rifle had finally proved itself in combat, in the hands of Marines, in the campaign that turned the Pacific War. And that, precisely, was the moment the Marines began the process of taking it away. Chapter 9. Buried on the Beach. The Johnson rifle was not driven out of Marine service by failure. It was driven out by success, someone else's success, on factory floors in Massachusetts and Connecticut. That distinction is the whole point of this chapter, because it is the cruelest way for a good product to die, and it is a way that repeats across the history of manufacturing. Through 1942 and into 1943, the reason the Johnson rifle had a place in Marine hands steadily disappeared. That reason had never been that the Johnson was superior. It was that the Garand could not yet be supplied in the numbers required. But the Garand lines were catching up, and then racing ahead. Springfield and Winchester between them were pouring out meters-1 rifles by the hundreds of thousands and eventually into the millions. The shortage that had opened the door for the Johnson was closing. And once the Garand was available to everyone, the entire logic of a second, non-standard rifle, with its own spare parts, its own magazines, its own loading procedures, its own armorer's training, collapsed. That is the tyranny of the standard. An army in the field does not want 2 rifles that do the same job. 2 rifles means 2 supply chains, 2 sets of spare parts stocked in every depot, 2 manuals, 2 sets of trained armorers, 2 of everything, for no gain in capability once the standard weapon is abundant. Every logistician in every army understands this in the bone. The moment the Garand was plentiful, the Johnson was not an asset, it was a complication. The mathematics of a second weapon type are brutal and mostly invisible, which is why they are so easy to underestimate and so decisive in the end. A rifle in the field is not a single object. It is the object plus a long tail of support that has to exist everywhere the object goes. The spare firing pins and extractors and springs stocked in every depot from the factory to the front. The magazines and the specific loading tools. The printed manuals. The armorers trained to diagnose and repair that specific mechanism. The inspection gauges. The requisition codes. For the standard rifle, All of that already exists at full scale, because it has to exist for the millions of standard rifles in service. For a few hundred non-standard rifles, all of that has to be duplicated in miniature, a whole parallel tale of support maintained for a rounding error's worth of guns. The per-rifle cost of keeping a handful of Johnsons running was wildly higher than the per-rifle cost of a Garand. Not because the Johnson was a worse gun, but because it lacked the scale that made the support affordable. This is the commodity trap that closes on every challenger who is merely as good as the standard, and it closes hardest in exactly the moment the challenger seems to have succeeded. The Johnson had gotten into service. It had performed. It had earned respectful reports. And none of that could survive contact with the supply officer's arithmetic once the Garand was abundant, because the whole justification for tolerating the parallel support tail, the rifle shortage, had evaporated. A challenger product that cannot claim a decisive, category-defining advantage does not get grandfathered in out of sentiment or sunk cost. It gets rationalized away the instant the emergency that admitted it is over. Equality bought the Johnson a brief wartime tenancy. It could never buy ownership. The verdict that sealed it was, fittingly, not an insult but a compliment. After the fighting on Bougainville and the raid at Choiseul, the Marine officer, Victor Krulak, later one of the most respected generals in the Corps, reported on the Johnson rifle's combat performance. His assessment was that the Johnson performed similarly to the Meters 1, that there was little difference between the two. He meant it as a fair and honest evaluation, and it was. It was also, in procurement terms, a death sentence. Because in a standardized army, little difference between the two is the worst possible thing a non-standard weapon can be. If the Johnson had been dramatically better, there might have been an argument to keep it in a specialist role. Being merely equal to the rifle that was already everywhere gave the system no reason on earth to tolerate the burden of a second type. So the Corps did what supply logic told it to do. As the parachute units were reorganized and the 1st Parachute Regiment was eventually deactivated in early 1944, the Marines were ordered to give up their Johnson rifles. What happened to those rifles is one of the small, bleak images the story leaves behind. Some were returned to depots. Some, by various accounts, were simply buried in the sand on Bougainville beaches, because it was easier to bury them than to account for and ship home a few hundred non-standard rifles nobody had a further use for. The rest were eventually returned to the Netherlands Purchasing Commission, the nominal owner, for use by Dutch forces. The rifles Harry, Tully, and the scout snipers had carried went into the ground, or back into Dutch hands, and out of American service for good. No branch of the United States military ever again officially adopted the Johnson rifle. Its entire American combat career had begun with 23 donated guns and ended with a few hundred rifles buried on a beach or crated back to a foreign commission. In between, it had done everything its designer said it would do, and none of it had changed the outcome, because the outcome had been fixed by production numbers, not battlefield performance. As good as loses to already standard. That is the sentence to carry out of this chapter. A challenger product that is merely equal to an entrenched standard does not win on merit, because merit was never the contest. The contest is the cost of switching and the cost of maintaining a second type, and against those costs, equality is defeat. The Johnson rifle was equal to the Garand, and equal was exactly, precisely, not enough. Sameness, not failure, is what finished the rifle. The light machine gun, though, was another matter entirely, because the light machine gun was not merely equal to anything, it was genuinely different, and difference, unlike equality, can find a market of its own. Chapter 10. The Wandering Gun. The rifle ended in the sand. The machine gun went around the world. This is the redemption chapter of the story, but it is a strange and telling kind of redemption, because the thing that gets redeemed is the product, not the company, and not the man. The Johnson light machine gun succeeded, over and over, in exactly the way the whole enterprise had failed, quietly, through side deals and improvisation, in the hands of people who sought it out for what it could do, entirely disconnected from any orderly business Johnson Automatics could capture and turn into a going concern. The first and most famous of these adopters was an elite unit with a name out of legend, the 1st Special Service Force, the joint American and Canadian commando outfit later mythologized as the Devil's Brigade. These were men trained for raiding, for mountains, for moving fast and hitting hard behind enemy lines, and they wanted the lightest, most portable automatic firepower they could get. The bar was too heavy for how they intended to fight. The Johnson light machine gun was close to perfect. And so, in one of the most quietly revealing transactions of the entire story, the 1st Special Service Force acquired its Johnson guns not through a normal procurement contract, but by trading for them. By the common account, they got 125 Johnson light machine guns from the Marines in exchange for plastic explosives. That is how the best customers for Johnson's best product got it. A barter of guns for demolition charges between two units, off to the side of any official supply system. Sit with that transaction for a moment. because it is the whole tragedy of the company in a single image. The first Special Service Force was exactly the customer Johnson's light machine gun had been built for. A mobile, hard-hitting, lightly equipped force that needed portable automatic firepower more than it needed anything else. In a functioning market, that unit would have placed an order, and the money would have flowed to the company that designed and built the gun, and Johnson Automatics would have had a second product with a real and defensible customer base. Instead, the perfect customer acquired the perfect product by swapping explosives for it with another unit, in a barter that never touched the company's accounts at all. The demand existed, the product existed, the match was ideal, and the maker was cut entirely out of the value, because by the time the demand found the product, the transaction had nothing to do with buying weapons from Johnson Automatics. That pattern repeated everywhere the gun traveled, and it is the reason the machine gun's global success never became the company's salvation. Each new user, the Devil's Brigade, the Free French, the fighters in the Philippines and Cuba, acquired guns that had already been built and already been paid for, once, by the dead Dutch contract, and were now simply changing hands as surplus, as barter, as war booty, as whatever the moment made them. Not one of those transfers sent revenue back to the enterprise in Rhode Island that had designed the weapon. The gun was creating value across half the world, and the value was being captured by whoever happened to be holding the guns when a new war created new demand. A product's success and a company's success are not the same thing, and they can come completely apart. Johnson's gun is one of the cleaner examples in the history of small arms of a product that triumphed while its maker starved. From there, the guns scattered across the map in a way that reads almost like fiction. Johnson light machine guns and rifles went to the Dutch, of course, who kept using both for years. In 1943, a batch of about 1,000 rifles was built for Chile, chambered in the 7mm cartridge South American armies favored, with barrels reportedly sourced from Mexico. In April of 1944, the United States War Department, sitting on the embargoed and undelivered Dutch weapons it had once refused to release, offered the Free French around 10,500 Johnson rifles and 1,500 light machine guns, the same weapons it had blocked from export, now handed to a different ally when it suited American purposes. The secret that was too sensitive to sell in 1940 became a convenient surplus giveaway 4 years later. And the gun kept going, long past the war. Johnson weapons turned up in the Philippines, in the hands of forces caught up in the post-war Hukbalahap rebellion, and in the Pacific fighting that bled into the Korean era. Most striking of all, the Johnson light machine gun appeared in the Cuban Revolution. Photographs and accounts place the gun in the hands of Ernesto Guevara's forces, the revolutionary known as Che. A weapon designed by a Harvard-educated Boston lawyer for a Dutch colonial contract, built in a rented textile mill in Rhode Island, ended up being fired by Marxist guerrillas in the Sierra Maestra. And a few years after that, Johnson weapons were reportedly present in the training and equipment around the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961, on the other side of that same Cuban story. Trace the path, and the strangeness of it comes clear. Rhode Island to the Dutch, East Indies to Marine paratroopers to a commando brigade's barter, to the Free French, to the Philippines, to Cuba. The product wandered into more armies and more wars than most weapons actually adopted by a major power. It succeeded, in the sense of being wanted and used and effective, on several continents, and Johnson Automatics captured almost none of that value. The barter for explosives put no money on the company's books. The post-war surplus deals, the French transfer, the appearances in Cuba, were the movements of guns already built and long since paid for by the dead Dutch contract, changing hands in a world the company no longer had any part in. The product had a magnificent second life. The business did not get to live it. Value, once created, does not automatically flow back to whoever created it. It flows to whoever holds the asset when the demand appears, and by then the company that made the asset was gone. A product can outlive every plan its maker ever had for it. The Johnson gun conquered the world, in its modest way, gun by gun and unit by unit. The company that made it could not survive the peace, and the peace was coming. And with it, the one enemy Johnson had no design clever enough to defeat: the absence of a war to sell into. Chapter 11. A contractor without a war. Every wartime supplier faces the same reckoning when the war ends, and most of them are destroyed by it. The reckoning is simple. The single enormous customer that justified the whole enterprise, the war itself, disappears. And it disappears suddenly, and it takes the contracts with it. A company organized entirely around supplying a war is, on the day the war ends, a company organized around nothing. Johnson Automatics met that reckoning in the worst possible position, because it had never had the one thing that lets a war contractor survive the peace, which is a durable peacetime line of business. The great arms companies that came through 1945 intact came through it because they held commercial products, sporting guns, hunting rifles, civilian markets they could return to when the government orders dried up. Johnson had none of that. He had a military rifle no military would adopt, A military machine gun no military had officially bought, a dead foreign contract, and a rented factory. When the war ended, the thin justification for the whole operation ended with it. The contrast with the companies that survived is the instructive part, because they survived by design, not by luck. Winchester came through the peace because it had a deep civilian business in sporting rifles and shotguns and ammunition, a hunting and shooting market that existed in war and peace alike, and that market caught the company when the government contracts fell away. The same was broadly true of the other established arms makers who lasted. They were not merely war contractors. They were consumer products, companies that also took military work when it came, and the consumer base was the keel that kept them upright when the military tide went out. That diversification was not glamorous. It was often the least exciting part of those companies. It was also the thing that let them exist across the long stretches of peace when nobody was placing million-dollar orders for infantry weapons. Johnson had built the opposite kind of company, and he had built it that way partly by circumstance and partly by choice. The circumstance was that his one big contract was military and foreign. The choice was that all his energy, all his fighting, all his ambition had gone into a military weapon and a military argument, and almost none into establishing the dull, durable civilian product line that might have carried the company through peacetime. When the war ended, he had no keel. He had a hull built entirely for one voyage, and the voyage was over. The frantic post-war improvising, the surplus conversions, the indoor BB gun, the custom gunsmithing, was the sound of a man trying to build a keel after the storm had already passed, from the scraps of a ship that had been designed never to need one. What Johnson did in those years is a study in a company shrinking toward its own vanishing point, trying one small thing after another to stay alive. There were surplus Johnson rifles and parts, and the company worked at converting them, sporterizing them, turning military weapons into hunting rifles for a civilian market. Johnson turned his hand to entirely different products, including an indoor target gun, a catapult-powered BB gun for practice shooting in confined spaces, developed in the late 1940s. He maintained a custom shop for converting bolt-action rifles to various hunting calibers, later operating out of Hope Valley, Rhode Island. He kept designing, kept tinkering, and kept his name attached to arms and ammunition through writing, because he was a genuinely prolific author on the subject, eventually publishing several books and dozens upon dozens of magazine articles. But look at the trajectory underneath the activity. This was a man who, a few years earlier, had testified before the United States Senate about arming the American military, who had built a rifle factory to fill a contract worth more than $1 million, who had gone to war with the Ordnance Department in the national press. And now he was converting surplus rifles one at a time and designing a BB gun for indoor practice. The scale of the enterprise had collapsed by an order of magnitude, and then by another. The company was not building the future of American small arms anymore. It was doing gunsmith's piecework and looking for anything that might pay a bill. There is no shame in any of the individual efforts. The indoor target gun was a clever product. The sporterizing work was honest and skilled, but none of it was a business at the scale the company had been built to operate, and none of it threw off the kind of money that could sustain a manufacturing enterprise with a factory, a workforce, and Melvin Johnson's ambitions attached to it. The company was living off the scraps of its own former self, and the scraps were running out. A firm built on a single wartime contract has no natural second act. When the contract and the war are gone, there is nothing underneath to catch it, because nothing underneath was ever built. Johnson had spent the good years fighting the army and racing to fill the Dutch order, and in all that urgency there had never been the time, or the capital, or frankly the inclination, to construct the boring, durable, commercial base that carries an arms company through the long stretches when nobody is fighting. He had built a spectacular structure on a single pillar, and the pillar was the war, and the war was over. The name on the door was worth a little less every month, and then came the year it stopped being worth anything at all. Chapter 12. The Auction and the Homecoming. Johnson Automatics reached the end as an independent company in early 1949. The enterprise Melvin Johnson had built out of a $300 prototype, a Senate hearing, a Dutch contract, and a rented Rhode Island mill filed for bankruptcy and was liquidated. The company that had gone to war with the United States Army lost its last war, which was the ordinary war every business fights, the one against running out of money, and it lost it quietly, with no hearing and no headline. That is the literal death of the company. But the format's real subject is what happens after a company dies, the way the assets and the name and the product move on without it. And in Johnson's case, that afterlife holds the sharpest ironies in the whole story. Start with the rifles themselves, because they came home, and they came home exactly the way Johnson had always wanted them sold, and he did not get to be the one who sold them. Through the early 1950s, the surplus Johnson rifles that had ended up in Dutch hands after the war came onto the market. In 1953, a California firm, Winfield Arms Company, bought a large quantity of surplus Dutch Johnson rifles, by one account around 16,000 of them, and imported them into the United States. Winfield refurbished them, sporterized some, and sold them to American civilians for something in the range of $70 to $110 apiece. This is where the distinction between a brand and a company comes into focus, because it is the distinction the whole story has been circling. A company is a living organization. Employees, a factory, contracts, a payroll, a balance sheet, a thing that can go bankrupt and cease to exist. A brand is something thinner and more durable, a name, a reputation, an association in a buyer's mind that a rifle called a Johnson is a certain kind of object. Johnson Automatics, the company, died in 1949. The Johnson name did not, quite. It lived on, faintly, as a thing collectors and importers and sporterizers could still trade on, a mark of quality attached to a few thousand surplus rifles working their way through the civilian market a decade after the enterprise behind the name had folded. The company was gone. The brand was still worth a modest markup to somebody else, but the man who had built both captured neither. When Winfield sold those rifles at a profit through the 1950s, that profit belonged to Winfield, not to Johnson, and not to the dead company. The value in the Johnson name at that point was worth precisely nothing to Melvin Johnson, because he no longer owned the vehicle that could have monetized it. He had, by then, largely moved on. He sold what remained of his interests and knowledge into the orbit of the established industry, working for a time as a designer for Winchester after the company's chairman took an interest in his talents. The founder ends up as an employee of the giants, his own company liquidated, his own rifles being sold for profit by strangers, his own name worth more to other people than to him. The brand outlived the company. The company's death took the founder's stake in the brand down with it. What was left of the value went to whoever showed up with cash and a distribution channel. Weigh what that means against everything that came before. The rifles the United States government would not buy and would not let Johnson export, and then embargoed, and that finally scattered to the Dutch and were captured and buried and surplused, came back to the United States in the 1950s and were sold, over the counter, to American hunters and collectors as commercial sporting rifles. Johnson had spent his whole career wanting to sell rifles to Americans, first the military and then, failing that, anyone at all. And in the end, thousands of his rifles were indeed sold to Americans, refurbished and imported and marked up by another company, years after his own firm was bankrupt and gone. The homecoming he had wanted happened. He simply was not the one who profited from it, because the company that bore his name no longer existed to collect a cent. Now turn to the man, because Melvin Johnson's personal trajectory in these same years holds the most pointed irony of all. Recall the whole engine of the tragedy. Johnson had made himself the permanent enemy of the Army Ordnance establishment by attacking its rifle in public, and that enmity had helped ensure his company never got the domestic contract that might have saved it. And what did Melvin Johnson do at the end of the 1940s, as his company died? In 1949, he transferred into the Army Ordnance Corps Reserve. He put on the uniform of the very branch he had fought. He would rise, over the following years, to the rank of colonel in that ordnance establishment. In 1951, he was appointed a weapons consultant to the Secretary of Defense. The outsider who had spent the war years as the Ordnance Department's most public critic became, in peacetime, an ordnance officer and a consultant to the Pentagon. There is no evidence this was cynical, and the point is not to paint it as surrender, it is only to observe the shape. The man could not beat the institution from outside, and the fight from outside had helped cost him his company. And so, in the end, he joined it. He spent his last productive years inside the establishment that had frozen him out, respected now as an expert, drawing on exactly the knowledge the fight had been about all along. He even, for a period in the early 1950s, worked as a designer for Winchester, the very company the Army had tooled up to build the Garand that beat him. He had spent a decade fighting the ordnance establishment from the outside. Now he wore its uniform and advised its masters. And in the work he did next, from inside, the single idea at the very center of his lost rifle was about to win the war he had actually been fighting all along, on a battlefield he never lived to see clearly. Chapter 13. The Bolt That Won. Go back to the very first chapter, to the one piece of the rifle set aside with a promise it would still be turning long after the company was dead. The bolt. The multi-lug rotating bolt, the piece that locked into the barrel by turning, the design Johnson had traced to an old Austrian mechanism and made central to his rifle. That bolt is the thing nobody could repossess, and it is the reason this story does not simply end in a Rhode Island bankruptcy filing. In the years after his company failed, as he did his consulting and his writing and his custom gunsmithing, Melvin Johnson connected with a small, ambitious California firm called Armalite, a company trying to design radically modern rifles using new materials and new ideas. Armalite was developing the rifles that would become the AR-10 and, most importantly, the AR-15. And Johnson, with his decades of expertise and his particular knowledge of locking systems, consulted on that work, bringing the thinking he had spent his life on, including the rotating multi-lug bolt concept at the heart of his own rifle, into the design conversation. The rifle at the center of that work, the AR-15, was principally the design of a gifted engineer named Eugene Stoner, and the intellectual lineage of its rotating bolt is a matter gun historians parse carefully, with Stoner's own contribution central. The point here is not to hand Johnson sole credit for a rifle another man designed. It is narrower and more precise than that. Johnson had spent his career championing recoil operation and a multi-lug rotating bolt that locked directly into the barrel, at a time when the American establishment had committed to a different path. He had lost that fight, comprehensively, in the marketplace and in the halls of the Ordnance Department. And then the design philosophy he had backed, the rotating multi-lug bolt locking into a barrel extension, turned out to be the philosophy at the heart of the rifle that would define American infantry weapons for the next 60 years. He had been on the winning side of the technical argument all along. He was simply on the losing side of it for the entire period when it might have made his company rich. There is a general lesson buried in that timing, and it is one of the quieter truths of how technology and business intersect. Being technically right too early is often indistinguishable, on the balance sheet, from being wrong. The market and the institutions that buy from it move on their own schedule, driven by sunk costs and standards and politics and the plain inertia of what already exists, and an idea that is correct can sit unrewarded for decades until that schedule finally comes around to it. By the time the rotating bolt's moment arrived in the standard American rifle, Johnson's company was long dead, and Johnson himself would not live many more years to see how completely his side of the argument had won. The idea was vindicated. The vindication arrived at the address of a company that no longer existed, forwarded to a designer at another firm, and stamped, in effect, returned to sender. The AR-15 became the Meters 16. The Meters 16 and its descendants became the standard rifle of the United States military, carried by American soldiers from the 1960s through the wars of the 21st century. And the basic pattern spread to militaries around the world. And at the heart of that rifle's action is a rotating bolt that locks multiple lugs directly into a barrel extension. The same fundamental locking principle, the same family of ideas that Melvin Johnson had built into the rifle the Army rejected in 1940. Now, set the two facts side by side, because this is the payoff the entire story has been walking toward. The United States Army bought not one Johnson rifle, not one. It rejected the rifle, blocked its export, and let the company that made it die. And then the same United States Army spent the next half-century and more issuing to nearly every soldier it had a rifle whose bolt is a direct descendant of Melvin Johnson's thinking. The Army that would not buy a single rifle from him carried his idea into every war it fought. The design lost the contract and won the century. It lost on the balance sheet of Johnson Automatics and won on the balance sheet of the entire American military, decades later, in another company's rifle, on the Army's own shoulder. Johnson kept working almost to the end. He developed a Wildcat cartridge, the .22 Spitfire, a neck-down version of the .30 carbine round, drawing on his old interest in small, fast projectiles. He kept writing and consulting. And then, in 1965, on a business trip to New York City, Melvin Maynard Johnson Jr. died suddenly of a heart attack. He was in his mid-50s. He was buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, not far from where the whole thing had started, a Boston lawyer to the end. There is one final irony, and it lands after his death, which somehow makes it fit. In 2003, the United States Army Ordnance Corps, the institutional descendant of the very department that had spent Johnson's career freezing him out, that had rejected his rifle, blocked his exports, and outlasted his company, inducted Melvin Meters Johnson Jr. into its Hall of Fame. The establishment that would not buy his rifle and would not forgive his criticism and helped ensure his company's death eventually enshrined him among its honored figures. The recognition he had fought for and been denied in life was granted, at last, by the same institution 38 years after he was gone. Losing the company and winning the argument are not mutually exclusive. Johnson lost the company. He won the argument. He simply won it on someone else's balance sheet, decades too late to do the company or himself any good. Conclusion. The name on the ammunition. Here is the whole thing, compressed into one cold inventory. One rifle and one light machine gun. A $300 prototype. A single foreign contract from a colony about to fall. A rifle factory improvised in a rented textile mill in 5 months. 23 rifles donated to get into a war. A few hundred guns in Marine hands, some of them buried on a beach. A machine gun that wandered to several continents and into Che Guevara's hands. A bankruptcy in 1949. and a bolt that ended up on the shoulder of nearly every American soldier for the next 60 years. The company lasted, as an independent enterprise, a little over a decade. The idea at its center is still in service. The business story lives in the gap between those two facts, between the company that died and the idea that did not. And that gap has a precise cause. Johnson Automatics failed not because its product was bad. Its product was excellent. It failed because it was a company with essentially one possible customer, and that customer was also its regulator, its censor, and, after 1940, its enemy. A firm in that position does not control a market. It exists at the sufferance of an institution that can refuse to buy, refuse to let anyone else buy, and simply wait. Melvin Johnson built a very good rifle inside that cage, and the quality of the rifle could not file down a single bar. Restate the decisions as what they were. The decision to design a better rifle than the Army's was sound engineering. The decision to prove it was reasonable ambition. The decision to prove it in public, in the press and the Senate, against the only customer large enough to sustain the company, was the fatal one. And everything after it was consequence. The Dutch contract was the right move available to a man with no domestic buyer, and it tied the company's survival to events on the far side of the planet. The 5-month factory was a real achievement built on a single pillar. And the pillar was a war. And the war ended. And the company had built nothing underneath to stand on when it did. Name the error plainly. Because the promise of this account was to name the cost. The error was not the criticism itself. Johnson may well have been right about the Garand's gas system, and the criticism, in a vacuum, was fair. The error was failing to grasp that when the entire market is a single institution, being right about that institution in public is a business decision with a price, and the price is the institution's permanent hostility, applied through every lever it holds. Johnson paid that price in full. He paid it in the lost contract, in the blocked exports, in the embargo, in the buried rifles, and finally in the bankruptcy. Being right cost him the company. It is a cost that appears on no income statement, and it is the largest number in this entire story. There is a second error underneath the first, quieter and more structural, and it is the one that generalizes best to any company watching this. Johnson organized his entire enterprise around a single customer and a single moment, the American military and the coming war, and he built nothing to survive the failure of either. When the military said no, he had no domestic base to fall back on. When the war ended, he had no peacetime business to carry him through. Each time, the problem was the same. Everything depended on one thing going right, and when that one thing went wrong, there was no second leg to stand on. The public fight was the dramatic mistake, the one with a villain and a grievance. The concentration was the boring mistake, the one with no villain at all, and it was every bit as fatal. A company that cannot survive its largest customer saying no is not a company with a difficult customer. It is a company with a single point of failure, waiting for the day that point fails. Weigh, too, what the Ordnance Department's conduct did and did not settle, because the channel takes no side in the old argument about whether the Johnson deserved to win. It is entirely possible that the Army's core decision was correct, that standardizing on the Garand, already in production, was the right call for a nation about to fight a two-ocean war, and that switching to a merely comparable rifle would have cost more than it was worth. It is also possible that the export block and the personal freeze-out went beyond sound procurement into pure grievance, punishing a man for embarrassing the institution. Both can be true at once. The arithmetic that rejected the rifle and the spite that buried the company are not the same thing, and the honest verdict is that the first was probably defensible and the second probably was not. What is beyond dispute is the result. The rifle was good, the company is gone, and the reasons for each have now been laid on the table. And yet the name survived, after a fashion, and the idea survived completely, and that is the note the whole thing ends on. The rifles came home and were sold to Americans as sporting guns, just as their maker had always wanted, years after he could benefit. The machine gun outlived every plan he had for it. And the bolt, the small turning piece he set at the center of a rifle nobody would buy, became part of the standard weapon of the strongest military on Earth, which happened to be the exact military that had refused him. The company could be killed. The procurement fight could be lost. But the idea, once it existed, could not be recalled, embargoed, or buried on a beach. If you want to understand how an idea can outlive the company that carried it, how a product can win everywhere except on the ledger of the man who made it, and what it truly costs to be right in front of the only customer you have, Melvin Johnson and the rifle that fought the United States Army, is the case to study.